head to the public use statistics office and capture kind of the data, the overall in through the front gate head counting data. It's pretty coarse, but especially in the past 20 or so years, we worked a lot with the Park Service to get this method kind of standardized, at least within a park. And as much as possible, it's not always possible, but as much as possible across parks, so that we can kind of consider things apples to apples. In class, we talked about use counting and distribution of use, stuff like that. And one of the problems we posed is when you have a national park like a Great Smoky Mountains National Park with several highways through it that people aren't necessarily exclusively using for park reasons. So it's kind of the same situation as we have on the Shawnee. There's absolutely many hundreds of thousands of people moving through the Shawnee on an annual basis, but you have to adjust those numbers in some standardized, some defensible way to understand, okay, if you're just commuting through Shawnee National Forest, it doesn't really count as a use for the Shawnee National Forest in the same way that a fully internal forest or park without any big highways through it can more or less count one-to-one with the people that they identify as even on the roadways through that park. Yosemite Valley is another. There is not a ton of ways in or out, and everybody who's at Yosemite Valley is there for Yosemite Valley. So that's whether you're working or recreating, we can split that out pretty easily. So that brought us to the Public Use Statistics Office, PUSO, and that's a functional unit of the Park Service's Statistics Division. So if you really like math, but you also like parks, there's a place for you working in the Park Service. And like I said, the system is supposed to be mostly standardized as much as anything like this can be standardized, because there is a lot of seasonal turnover in the particular park staff that are going to be doing this kind of stuff, like front gate tallies, permit office, that kind of a thing. A lot of seasonal workers, you know, in and out through there, which is normal and is kind of how the Park Service and other agencies structure introductory positions there. It's a ton of work to get a number that is not only like recognizable, but is an accurate reflection of what people think that number should really be. So again, the numbers underlying the graphs that you looked up, or the table or tabular information that you looked up on the Public Use Statistics Office, they've had to harmonize that against, okay, if somebody is there for 8 hours, do we want to call that one visitor day? And if somebody's only there 2 hours, does that count as 1/4 of a visitor day? Or being at our park is so awesome that even 2 hours at our park counts as a day, right? You have to, there's not automatically a particular right answer on that. A place like Gateway Arch is not typically going to have people there for an entire 8, 12, or 16-hour day. But other parks like Acadia, it's very normal to be there for 24 hours at a stretch, or 72 or 96. So the number doesn't always mean exactly what folks think it means when they're first looking at this stuff. So we're kind of teasing these nuances out a little bit. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to kind of pull up your research on your park as far as use level in some specific level. Was anybody encountering any trouble with just looking up the statistics on the URLs? Did that kind of work okay? Good. All right. In that case, let's jump into it. Would anybody like to start? We'll kind of answer or start with our first questions of it. Let's pull it back up here. There we go. So the 5-year forecast scenario. What is a basic, simple envelope, back of the envelope calculation for what your park's use level might be, factoring in the COVID rebound in 5 years from now, using the past 5 to 10 years to extrapolate forward to the next 5 to 10 years-ish? Anybody? Reese.
I can go first.
Okay.
My park is Voyagers. And going back to 2015 to now, those are the years I used. About 5 years from now, they're expected to have about 260,000 visitors, which is honestly a pretty slow growth rate. For reference, in 2021, they had 243,000 visitors.
Okay.
I don't know, you mentioned something about the whole park system shutting down in 2020.
Yes, for not the whole year period, but when quarantining was happening, they shut down the park system as a matter of public health as well.
Voyagers had actually a spike in visitation in 2020.
Okay.
I don't know if maybe they're counting like some of the surrounding like bigger lakes, people just using their boats on them in there.
Question. Okay.
But yeah, they like that number that I just gave you for 2027, 260,000. That's less than 2020, the visitation in 2020.
Okay, so that's not weird. I mean, it is what it is, but that is definitely an anomaly. So a lot of local neighborhood city parks, even in 2020, saw in a few cases even order of magnitude, like adding an extra zero onto the number levels of visitation, because a lot of folks were getting cabin fever during quarantining and would just go for a walk in their local park. The Green Earth parks here in Carbondale saw a huge spike in 2020. And things have mostly gotten back to normal for them, but Voyagers an urban proximate park? Is it the kind of place where folks can just sort of walk their dog on their lunch break or get a little stir crazy or get some cabin fever and do this, or is something else at play?
I would not consider Voyagers to be urban proximate.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good drive from any major city to get there. But I can see more of the locals like just taking their boat there on the weekend, maybe. But there's not really any huge cities near it. So.
Okay, right on. Another way to drill down on this particular wrinkle in sort of the usual expectation is to go down to some parks, not all, but some parks will collect more granular information. So smaller time slices and then aggregate those together into the big annual total. Some places have even hourly head counts by the front gate. Those tend to be much more urban proximate places where the level can shift quite a bit more meaningfully throughout a day or a week or a month versus, a place like Yosemite or Voyagers when the variation is much more seasonally based. So, okay, interesting. So not a huge amount of growth, but growth nonetheless. All right, so kind of follow on question to that. Given mile growth at Voyagers at least, what would you have to adjust potentially as superintendent to not get out in front of a coming wave that isn't coming maybe, but to the extent that even mile growth pushes up against capacity or starts to push people into sort of that nebulous, that crowding reflexive response space. Not that Voyagers is super busy. A couple 100,000 is really pretty low for most national parks. Is there anything, Reese, that you would have to change or update or address to kind of be ready for 2027 when it hits?
So to kind of think about this, I checked out how just visitation works at Voyagers. Specifically, I looked at the camping mainly, and every single site has to be reserved, like specifically even for like multi-day trips.
Okay.
So they have like, I feel like they have like perfect knowledge of what is the demand for their sites, and the reservations opened up on November 15th for next year. And so I went on to try and like check out how hard it is to get sites, and even on like holiday weekends, almost every site is open, starting like right now.
Okay.
So it's not one of those parks where you wait till midnight the day it opens to reserve. It seems like the demand is not insane right now. But I think with like their knowledge of demand with that reservation system, and also with Voyagers being, I think they have it's a unique situation where they have space to add more sites. They have a lot of like unused space in the park. it seems to me that they could just kind of like follow the demand, and as needed, you could increase the supply. Is I think the tactic that I think would be most effective
Yes.
at Voyagers right now.
Okay, right on. That that squares with my limited understanding of Voyagers. I've never actually been, but done some reading about it. Okay, sounds good. Anything in this, Reese, that kind of surprised or caught you off guard? Or is this pretty straightforward, at least at Voyagers?
At Voyagers, it seems pretty straightforward.
Mhm.
They've had spikes in visitation kind of randomly. Like in 1980, there was a peak of like over 260,000. In 2010, there was a peak around 260,000, and it's just kind of up and down between there. So I think it's kind of a unique park in that sense. It's not experiencing that like massive growth that other perhaps more well-known parks are right now.
Okay, right on. So let's talk about those earlier peaks for just a moment. If you don't have your graph in front of you, you can pull up the front page for our website. It's still got the examples for Acadia National Park going on there. And if Voyagers or your park, Carrie or whomever, if you're seeing some spikes or humps on the graph that have sharp cutoffs on the backside, as Acadia does in the 1980s, I believe. Let's see, that's about 1989. Again, this is an artifact of the data. That is not a meaningful step or state change in the graph. It's not like half of visitors just magically stop showing up 1 year to the next, except for meaningful discontinuous cases like 2020. Those are actually changes reflected in how the counts were done. So at Acadia National Park, they settled on capturing vehicular entries through the entrance station and not attempting to capture folks like walking into the park from Bar Harbor, for example, because that's highly variable and much more difficult to get a reasonable number with. So Bob Manning, some others did a mountain of research on regression counting to figure out, okay, how do we get a more meaningful number from just what we have excellent counting control at entrance stations where, each vehicle pulls up, they pay the fee, they drive on in for the day or the week or whatever. We can count those perfectly, pretty well. But somebody walking in from Bar Harbor, much harder, but that could be a lot of people in this particular case. And just as on the Shawnee at Acadia, there's a bunch of little towns inside the perimeter of the park. So how do you count those folks? So kind of starting in the 1990s and forward, so the last 20, 30 years, really mostly in the last 20, the Park Service has put their foot down. The stats folks at the Public Use Statistics Office, Fort Collins, put their foot down and said, guys, we have a bunch of numbers, but none of them mean anything because everybody's counting a little bit differently. Sometimes we're changing the protocol. This has to stop. And so that sort of harmonization or homogenization or standardization process occurs during this period, sort of post 1980s. So if your particular graph has something like that, it may not be reflective of reality. It may be reflective of technique, which is kind of a mind-boggling thing. But these days, for the past 20 or so years, a lot of parks have a consistent counting approach, very much more consistent statistics. And so some of the parks, not all of them, have like back calculated using the new techniques and some regression modeling. What are those historic numbers actually? Because they were counted differently, we think we can make some guesses on those, and they've adjusted those on the PUSO website, but not all the parks have done that. It's absolutely painstaking work. And, folks are often not still alive who are doing the counting in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So if they can't find the records, can't do the correction in any reliable or verifiable way. So they have to let the old count numbers stand, even if we know that they're really pretty different than what we see today. So that is confusing, but that is a thing. So, all right, who's next?
I can go.
Go for it. Oh, we lost your audio. Go ahead and there you go.
Yeah, so the park I chose was Dinosaur National Monument that borders Utah and Colorado.
All right.
So to answer the questions that I put down, so what would my park look like from 5 years from now? I believe that tourism will grow again, like ever since like COVID, but that's not really when it dropped down the most. 90s was when it was at its peak of tourism, but I believe in the next 5 years it'll go back to what it's like reported in like the 90s or the late 80s. Yeah, and I have some screenshots of the reports that I found online. So like the total visitors and recreation visitors and all that.
All right. Would you like to screen share those or just talk us through them, or how do you want to go?
Yeah, I can screen share it just so you guys get a better idea.
All right, let's see if I can figure this out here. Share screen.
Okay.
Let's see. Awesome.
All right, so yeah. So since like 2016, yeah, like 80s, 90s at its was where it was at its peak, and then 2000s is when it just dropped down, and then it was slowly going back up.
Okay.
And right here is where it shows the annual visitors that were reported like from 2016 and then so on. And right here, 2020 COVID year didn't drop as much as I thought it would. And then, yeah, year after it went back up. And then, yeah, studies show that it's going to continue on growing.
Okay. That's a pretty big jump from 2020 to 2021.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so the what's your sense of if you had to kind of pick a number for 5 years from now, 2027 to 2030, somewhere in that range, what might be a guess based on kind of the trend of the past 5 or so years?
So within like the next 5 years, I'm gonna say, so right now it's like 22 million, right? So I would say it's gonna be like 30 to 40 million.
Okay, is that hundreds of thousands? Millions is pretty big for
like,
any American park.
Like I would say probably at its peak, like that includes like the next 5 years. It's like 2027, and then let's last report from like 2026. That will be my estimate.
So that's a pretty big change. I mean, that's a fairly significant amount of growth. And Dinosaur is pretty big, but its resources are extremely fragile and vulnerable to theft, unfortunately. Big changes in how the place looks with fossils on the ground.
Yeah.
Okay, so what would you do with kind of getting out in front of that huge, what might be a genuinely large wave of folks visiting Dinosaur?
I would say maybe, provide maybe more, in a way security that prevents like any sort of theft, or if there's like a huge number of people, I would say probably widen like the trails a little bit so it can fit like a certain amount of people. That also doesn't create any sort of impact to like any natural fossils or resources.
Okay, right on. So this strategy of increasing the effective supply of a resource by widening out trails is a good one for dealing with surge capacity. So the issue of the extreme fragility of those fossil resources, even though they're stone, we generally don't think of bedrock as being a particularly fragile resource, but these are a very, very specific distillation of bedrock.
Right.
with mineral intrusions replacing bone material and stuff like that. So one way that park managers use this question or this tactic of widening out a trail, they use what civil engineers refer to as, or developed as, a system of levels of service. So if you want to think about a sidewalk in downtown Carbondale versus a sidewalk on campus, those are really, I mean, physically observably different facilities.
Right.
There's a real difference in width. There's a difference in substrate. Some of the things have to be standardized by law, like those little pads of bumps. Those are called detectable surfaces for visually impaired folks to know that they're about to walk into traffic, and not just hitting a low spot in the pavement. But the idea of levels of service is that for like a tier 1 sidewalk, it might be a small pathway. It might just be gravel. Tier 2 might be, you know, paved, but also narrowed, 24 to 36 inches wide, all the way up to some of these sidewalks, and not even sidewalks, but like concrete plazas. If you've ever been to like a sporting arena where everybody is coming out of that arena all at the same time. And so for that particular spot where there's the spatial constraint of everybody coming out through the same sets of doors all at once after a game or a concert or ice capades or Disney on Ice or whatever, it needs to kind of transcend sidewalkness, as weird as that sounds. So that's at the extreme opposite end of level of service. And there are very sort of straightforward tables of what do you think the maximum, the peak. You design for the peak and build in some sort of padding or margin or excess capacity around that. Because if you can handle the peak, then you can automatically handle everything else. So it's kind of it's not really planning for a worst case scenario. It's really a good thing for more people to be in parks, but it is a potential worst case scenario if, you know, William, they're not following, you know, your prescriptions to widen out those sidewalks. So this is a real and structured and systematic thing that you've identified. That's a good tactic under the strategy of increasing effective supply. Is there anything else you would do? You mentioned presence patrols, like increasing surveillance kind of a thing. How would you go about that more specifically?
I would say maybe, you know, in a way that's like not like overly secure, where there's like not like security patrols after security patrols, but like there's like one like certain area that's kind of balanced out, that it's like in a way that's good enough to like to stop any sort of theft or anyone just like breaking any major rules, really, that also potentially that can impact like the environment, or like such as like wildlife or just anything that's natural out there.
Okay. So we got kind of the soft option of putting out lots of, you know, in-uniformed interpretive rangers, some volunteer custodial type folks who are just kind of circulating around, doing roving interpretation, as it's called. That's kind of a low-key way to increase engagement, but also really in a meaningful sense, have more boots on the ground, more of a visible, obtrusive presence. And, you know, people get that message. You know, parents with little kids are going to mind their kids a little bit more actively, making sure they're not climbing the walls and running off with fossils and stuff like that quite as much. There's always going to be some, but that's a thing. On up to, you know, armed presence patrols and that sort of a thing with your law enforcement rangers. That can be anywhere in that spectrum. And that is a very, very flexible solution that you identified versus the effective, but not real flexible solution of, you know, increasing trail width, number of miles of trails, hardening the trail surface from natural substrate to gravel to asphalt, tar and chip to concrete, or even to, you know, wooden or metal boardwalk, like raised surfaces. You can change the staffing levels on a day by day, hour by hour basis to kind of handle surges within a day. To the extent that you can afford to field more people out there. Okay, so if these guys are are staring down the barrel of a really major, like double-digit percentage increase in visitation, like your graph showed.
Yeah.
They may need to start like hiring and training folks now to be out in front of that. It takes a little bit of time to get things in order and working.
Yeah.
All right, cool, good answers. Anything surprise you about your data?
Anything surprising? Yeah, back to the whole COVID thing. I mean, I guess in a way, it really just brought more people outside. That's probably why the ratings didn't like drop as drastically as like it would in the past. Or yeah, so that's in a way that's what surprised me. But at the same time, it's like I can also can relate to that because when COVID happened, it really got me to go outside more. So I can see that.
Well, good. Hopefully that habit sticks with people. It looks like it's kind of wearing off a bit, but there's really been an excellent spike in 2021, in 2020 for Reese, and here in 2022, the numbers are still generally very, very high. So, so Williams' data in the 80s and 90s showed a more gradual tail off and dip and then recovery than, for example, the Acadia example that I posted on the course website. So there are other factors dealing with that as well, or figuring into that as well. In the 90s, gasoline was really, really, really way cheaper than it is now. And 30 years later, with wages basically staying static or contracting versus inflation, people are making a lot less money now than they used to in the 1990s, even doing the exact same job relative to inflation. So that is in the aughts, with the dot-com bubble bursting and the 2008 financial recession. I mean, that put a lot of people into a tailspin. Those are some reasons why, to the extent there is a meaningful dip in visitation when using consistent counting techniques all throughout this period is 40-year time. That is part of it. Also, American citizen population growth has really, really, really cratered, and we are soon to go the way of European countries and Japan, for example, where with like endogenous, not indigenous, but endogenous people, starting, growing up, living as citizens in the United States, our population growth rate is likely to go negative fairly soon. And in some demographic groups, it already has. So where we have population growth in the United States is immigration. And a lot of immigrants don't necessarily have immediately, when they first arrive, the financial headspace to go on that big vacation to a place like Yellowstone or Yosemite. So we're seeing that reflecting change in the demographics, but also in just the basic numbers over time. Things are shifting, and this shows up in these graphs, but you got to dig a little bit deeper to get after the why instead of just the what or how many. All right, nice work. Cool. Carrie, can you take us through your park? And we're curious to hear what's going on.
So I've got pictured rocks in Michigan. And so basically what I was saying is since like 2012, it has just gone way up. Like in 2012, it was like 500,000. And then in 2021, it jumped up to 1.5 million. So it more than doubled in that amount of time. And so the prediction thing I'm seeing over like the next 5 years is gonna get like another I want to say 250,000 people they're guessing, and it just keeps going up for the whole prediction line I did.
Okay, that sounds like a fairly steep line, even as far back as a decade ago.
It's starting to middle out, like halfway through I did it to 2060. and about halfway through it middles out a little bit.
Okay.
At like 1,750,000 people, but it still rises just a little less fast.
Okay, so that is still multiple times growing, more than they were dealing with just a decade ago. So Pictured Rocks isn't, in terms of land space, it's not particularly huge, as I recall. We were talking about it 2 weeks ago,
No,
you know, with climate change and rain and trails and stuff like that. Is there space to fit all these extra folks? Is this a physical carrying capacity problem in 2027, or?
If they stay on the land, it will be very crowded and people will be elbowing each other to the faces. But they also do have like a large water section. It is a national lake shore. So I'm assuming that a lot of them is going to be filling the lake up a lot. Like a good part of it is like some islands, and like the cliffs from the waterway are like a major draw. So I'm assuming the growth, it is going to impact both the water and the land, kind of filling it. So it won't be quite as bad. It's still going to be intense, but they will spread out a little bit more maybe.
Okay, so that's my take on that is that it's good news that, you know, traffic is increasing. We want to see more people in parks always. And I also take it as good news that a lot of the space that the additional visitors will need to occupy is on the water. So aside from the obvious safety concerns and the ecological concerns of running vehicles fairly continuously, two-stroke, much smaller boat motors are pretty dirty. They can leak a lot of oil and partially combusted fuel into the water column. This is a huge problem on the East Coast and a bunch of marine parks in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so they had to start requiring people use paddles or four-stroke engines, you know, full size, not oil burning engines. And that solved that particular problem very well. With Pictured Rocks, my understanding is that most folks, correct me if I'm wrong, I may be wrong, Carrie, but I think most folks are availing themselves of the islands through concession hired, essentially tour boats and ferries. Is that correct? Or is it mostly folks trailering in their own vehicles?
That is correct. The majority of people do use concession to own. Lake Superior can be pretty wild and crazy. The park in general does have kind of a high incident report because people have a misconception on distance and they think the islands are a lot closer than they actually are. So they get stuck in weather that they're not capable of handling, or they get knocked out of their boats by the wind, by the waves. And it makes a lot of bad situation. But I can see a little bit more incident, like with more people at the park, that's going to bump that incident up, especially if the people come in don't have like a lot of experience doing like open water like that, because a lot of people don't think of like a lake as being open water, but the Great Lake is very much open water. The waves and stuff act very different than they would from like Crab Orchard. They're very, very different. And people need to be prepared for that. Otherwise, having that high incident report and the high number of people is gonna go berserk, and they would have to start preparing way early, like rescuers and stuff. They actually have their own rescue rangers. I don't know what you call them up there, and they're doing quite a bit of work already. So they would probably have to get other locations for their bases, just with there being more people and such too.
That's about it. So this brings us to the question, what do we do about it? Reese has identified a strategy. William had a couple of good ideas. So we can increase supply of the resource, you know, add more space, make the park bigger. We can increase effective supply. with trails or better access. So working with tour operators to add additional tours, for example, would be increasing effective supply of the water-based resources. We can modify use either indirectly through information and education. We can modify use directly by fencing people out or permitting people into certain spaces and not others. We could harden up the resource somehow. I don't know how we'd harden up Lake Superior. That's a pretty big meatball to swallow. Or we could limit use. We could just close that front gate and say, sorry, Pictured Rocks is full right now and you can come back tomorrow, or you can wait in line for someone else to leave. What do you think, Carrie, might be a good, given what sounds like fairly aggressive growth in the next 5-10 years? What do you think might be a good strategy or combination of strategies at Pictured Rocks?
I think
Uh-oh, I'm losing you. All right, I'm gonna have to reconnect here. There we go. All right.